Well, let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you all to today's two-part webinar series, where we are having a national thought leader in entrepreneurship ecosystem building joining us to talk about effective economic development through entrepreneurship in Oklahoma City's BIPOC community. This is the series today, and then this evening at 5:30. Specifically speaking to Black entrepreneurship and community growth in Oklahoma City. We expect our audience to include policymakers, economic development practitioners, community leaders and builders, local business owners, and so many other professionals and community stakeholders. So we're so thankful for you all joining us, because we know each and every one of you plays a vital role in the cultivation of a resilient and inclusive economy. So for today, for this webinar, we're going to talk about how entrepreneurship can best be leveraged for economic growth in Oklahoma City as a whole. I am one of your hosts, Mariana Adams. I'm the Executive Director of Progress OKC. We are a nonprofit community development and emerging financial institution that's created to strengthen and preserve both the social and economic fabric of under-resourced communities. And we achieve this through a variety of ways, including housing development, business lending, and other capacity enhancement efforts. During the pandemic, we've been able to provide either or both technical assistance, as well as zero interest loans to nearly 65 businesses in Oklahoma City. And we're so proud of that work, but we know it would not be possible without collaborators, without our partners, because this work cannot be done in a vacuum. And so we're so grateful for the partnership with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, as well as the Association of Central Oklahoma Governments. But before I introduce them, a few housekeeping. This session is being recorded for those who want to revisit some aspects of this conversation, or those that are not able to join us. This will be recorded and posted to both Progress OKC's and ACOG's website. In addition, I will here in a minute launch some poll questions and encourage you all to respond to those. And the last thing is that there will be hopefully some opportunities for question and answers throughout the session, but specifically at the end. So I talked about our partnership with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City and the Association of Central Oklahoma Governments. Let's hear from Matt Weaver, representing ACOG today. Matt.
Well, buenos dias, howdy, and good morning, everybody. My name's Matthew Weaver, and I manage the Community and Economic Development Division for the Association of Central Oklahoma Governments, which is kind of like, what's that? ACOG, what councils of governments do, we're of, by, and for the government, and we're not the government. My council of governments covers the 4 central counties of Oklahoma. I convene and facilitate all sorts of discussions with the 50 municipalities within our jurisdiction. On the macro level, our council of government, we deal with tens of millions of dollars in transportation dollars. We are the 911 training center. We're also the Clean Cities Coalition leader, and we're also leaders with EV in the state. The Community Economic Development Division on the micro level for what ACOG does is just what it sounds like. It's about community and economic development. What are those wants and needs throughout those 50 municipalities? And what are the gaps that are not being provided by other economic development organizations where a council of governments can step in? And what we're finding, what we have found out is obviously minority business development assistance for small and minority businesses has been lacking. It's been kind of a one-off. ACOG, we're not about the one-offs, we're about resiliency, and we're about systemic change. So in regards to this program, we're really excited to be able to support Progress OKC and our other partners to get the word out there to help assist all the individuals that reside within Central Oklahoma. ACOG is a fantastic resource that nobody knows about unless you're a municipal leader, and we're driving it down to pretty much the individual level, saying, you know what, these other economic development organizations in the area are great collaborators for us, and we could do much much better together if we can just make that happen. And that's how we came across with Progress OKC to help provide these opportunities. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to learn more. Looking forward to Dell.
Thank you so much, Matt. And then I will hand it over to Chad Wilkerson, representing the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Thank you, Chad, for joining us.
Thanks, Mariana, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name's Chad Wilkerson. I'm the Oklahoma City branch executive for the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and it's a pleasure to partner today with Progress OKC and ACOG in putting on these webinars. Just as a quick background on our Fed office in downtown OKC, our 45 or so employees work to study and share about the Oklahoma economy and banking and community development efforts across our state. And our team of bank examiners work to help ensure the safety and soundness and fair lending standards of Oklahoma financial institutions. In regard to the webinars on entrepreneurship and economic development today, I just wanted to mention a few introductory thoughts. First, at the Fed, we recognize small businesses have been disproportionately hit by the pandemic of the past year and a half, and smaller minority-owned businesses even more so. The Fed has responded, as you know, through supporting unique national programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, but we realize that the distribution and access can sometimes be difficult, especially for those most in need. Our bank recognizes this and works to identify and address these barriers through local outreach and developing resources and approaches like you'll hear about today. Small businesses make a difference in the Oklahoma City economy. I just looked at the 2019 data today, and 95% of the businesses in our metro area pre-pandemic had less than 50 employees, and they have helped drive a strong local economy so far in 2021, with metro area unemployment now down below 3.5% again, although still with mixed degrees of recovery across industries and demographic groups, and still a little bit below pre-pandemic labor force participation. So your views and experiences today are very important to us as we continue to work together on finding pathways towards full recovery in Oklahoma. And I'd now like to turn it over to our facilitator for the webinars, Dell Gines. Dell is a lead community development advisor for the bank and has done extensive work on entrepreneurship and economic development, especially in minority communities. We also co-authored an article a few months ago about the history and current activity in Black Wall Street, and enjoyed that very much. So Dell, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Chad. Matthew, a particular thanks to Mariana. You've been excellent, phenomenal work with. I've really enjoyed it and look forward to tonight and then what we're going to work on tomorrow. And I'm really excited I'm actually physically in Oklahoma City right now. I came down from Tuesday, actually, speaking at the Manhattan, Kansas K-State Extension Conference, which will probably be the first and probably the last for a while public, speech that I've given. And we had hoped and originally scheduled this to be kind of a hybrid with in-person and then also virtual, which I think would have been really exciting. Because I've come down to Oklahoma City quite a few times over the past couple of years, and always enjoy getting to meet people in person. The last time I was down here, we were doing the presentation on the Black Women Startups report that I wrote. Oklahoma City had one of the focus groups of the research that I did. It was really fun. I had a lot of great relationships built out through that. And then prior to that, I did the keynote presentation for the Black Chamber down here, which was also really fun. And then the other time I think I was down here, I did a presentation for the community, a big roundtable called Entrepreneurship as an Economic Development Strategy in Black Communities. And so I really like to get down here and get to meet new people. And hopefully you'll find this informative and thought-provoking and potentially helping you modify or reframe some of your economic development strategies, that you're going to do in the city. And I'm going to, pop up the screen real quick, and hopefully I can get this right. Let's see. All right. So hopefully, can everybody see this? Okay. Hopefully everybody can see that. And if we're squared away, one thing I do need to say, since Chad didn't say it, is the views in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, nor the Federal Reserve System. And a little bit more about the Fed, just expanding on what Chad talked about. We are the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. We are one of 12 regional banks. And the importance of the regional banks is that it really gives us opportunity to do things like this. You know, Chad as a branch executive, Steve as a community development advisor, you know, really being sensitive to the needs of Oklahoma and the rest of us out of the state. So for example, I'm in Omaha and I function out of our Omaha branch. We have a branch in Denver. And then also we have advisors in Kansas City, and we cover the 7 states. And this really allows us, as well as our president, Esther George, to represent us when it goes to making monetary policy decisions. And also we get a chance to really understand what our respective communities needs at the state and the city levels, and kind of do tailored programming, you know, specifically for you. And that's the importance of the regional banking system. As you know, Chad talked about some of the other things we do, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I do want to share briefly before we get into the meat of the presentation, some of the other things that we produced in this space through the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. So a lot around ecosystem building, some of you may be interested in. You can go to our website and find all of our information, including mine and Steve's work at kansascityfed.org. Me and Steve's work is under the community tab, and you can see what he does in workforce. You can see what I do in entrepreneurship. Some of the things that I think are particularly germane to this conversation we're going to have today are the last two on actually the last three. First of all, is like the super cool, you know, research that I got to do on Black women. It was just probably the highlight of my career at the Fed, probably the most recognizable work. Got cited in CNBC, Forbes, Black Enterprise, Inc. magazine, where I talk about the impact and the reasons why so many Black women are starting businesses, because most people don't realize from 2002 to 2012, Black women started over 1 million businesses. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that tonight at the meeting. Then we also wrote the guide on with Rodney Sampson from Opportunity Hub, known as the godfather of inclusive ecosystem building, called Building Entrepreneurship Ecosystems in Communities of Color. And the most recent work that we published was last year. And this is one of the reasons why I'm down here today and tomorrow, is a Small Business Owners of Color Recovery Guide, which is really kind of a broad-based set of concepts and ideas around how our communities can help businesses of color, which were disproportionately hammered by this pandemic during the recovery process. And I co-authored that with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And so these are some other things that are just out there that if you're interested, you want to check them out. You may find informative and help guide some of your work. Because I understand that a lot of individuals on here are touching on some form of community, economic, or workforce development. So when you get a chance, check that out. So let's get into the presentation. And for those who've heard me before, know that I like to keep, you know, complex subjects, you know, pretty light. Tonight, I'm going to actually have a lot more fun when we talk about Black business, because that's my thing, you know. That's where I came up through in my community in North Omaha, which I am going to talk about in a little bit too. And so this is a picture of Clint Eastwood. I don't know if you all remember the movie Gran Torino, and he was just this grumpy old guy, this grumpy old neighbor would sit on his porch and he would yell at people. And I remember, you know, when I first watched that movie, you know, I kind of laughed. And then, you know what, I realized I had to do some critical self-reflection and realize that that's me now at 48 years old, that I've become Clint Eastwood in my neighborhood. I have this corner lot and people just love to walk through the lot. You all that live on a corner know, and it's on a busy street too. And people just feel like they can just cut through my lawn. I'll even be out there doing stuff and they'll just look at me and I'll look at them and they'll look at me and I'll be like, go around. And so I have an office that's actually in the front of my house. And so I hear everything that's going on. And so when I hear, you know, people close or close to my lawn, you know, I start getting a lot of angst going on. And it reminded me a lot of when I was a kid. So I grew up I live in our Black community in Omaha. And I grew up in a 5-person household, and we had a neighbor called Mr. LaViolet. And those of you who have neighbors like this will immediately connect with me on that level. And so Mr. LaViolet was, you know, we were young kids. We had 5, like I said. And so we loved, like young kids like to do. We like to go out and play and have a good time and laugh and jump around and climb and throw things, all of that stuff. And I swear Mr. LaViolet had to be the grumpiest old man that I had ever known. As soon as we were about to touch his lawn, he opened up the door and he would yell at us, you know, and he kept his lawn up too. So he wasn't playing with his lawn. And I just remember, you know, thinking to myself when I was a little kid, maybe 9 or 10, why won't this guy just let me live my life? I want to be free and happy. And then I turned around and realized that just like I said, I was Clint Eastwood, that now I'm Mr. LaViolette too. Not only that, not only am I Mr. LaViolette, when I was 10 thinking that he was like 100 years old, he was probably my age. So that all brings me up to this. Now, these were my former neighbors, these beautiful young little girls. And this is actually my corner. Don't judge me for my lack of lawn care. So I'm in my office one day, and my wife always tells me, you need to de-escalate when people get on your yard. And so I'm sitting here, I'm in my office, I'm just doing my thing on my computer, and I hear these little kids yelling. And all of a sudden, I hear my anger beginning to increase, and I'm sitting here and I keep hearing them yelling. I'm like, what in the world is going on? Are these kids on my lawn again? I'm going to have to go out and give them a piece of my mind, like Mr. LaViolette. And so I walk out and I see these young ladies and I see that table and all of that stuff on there, right? And so I'm thinking to myself, wow, can you yell at little girls? And then I'm like, yeah, I can. Then I'm like, no, that's not prudent. Got to be a good neighbor like State Farm, right? So anyway, I walk out there and I say, hey, young ladies, what are you doing? And the tall one, she's the ringleader of the group, right? And so she says, oh, mister, we're out here selling lemonade. I said, oh, that's really cool. That's really great. You've been out here for a while. She said, yeah, we've been out here for about 3 or 4 hours. Making any money? She said, oh yeah, we're making a lot of money. And so I'm thinking to myself, that's really great. I like that entrepreneurial spirit, the energy. She's got her, sisters and cousins out there. They're all making money. They're grinding. People are stopping by on my corner, by the way, but they're stopping by and buying it. And so I'm like, okay. I said, you young ladies are doing phenomenal. I said, that's great. I said, I would like to buy, some lemonade from you. And I'm thinking, okay, at 10 cents, I got a little bit of change in my pocket. And she says, and so I say, okay, well, tell me how much it is. Now, mind you, these are, and I don't have one with me, the little styrofoam coffee cups. I said, that's great. Well, tell me how much it is. She said, oh, mister, yeah, I'll get you a cup of lemonade for $1. And I'm thinking to myself, $1 for a cup of lemonade that's in the size of a styrofoam coffee cup? And I'm thinking, but then she said, oh, but wait a minute, I can give you half a cup for 50 cents. So I'm thinking to myself, I like to support Black businesses and buy local. I'm going to buy it, but I still have a ton of student loan debt. So I gave her 50 cents and took a half a cup of quote unquote lemonade. And so as I'm drinking my lemonade, I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute. Now, for those of you who can see the picture clearly, look back and see what's in that container. That doesn't look like lemonade to you, does it? No, it's cool. It was Kool-Aid. So, and how much does it cost for a pack of Kool-Aid nowadays? 5 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents. So immediately I begin to calculate the return on investment in my own mind of what these young ladies were selling. I'm thinking, wow, she just, doubled her return on investment with my 1/2 a cup. And so I just encourage them. I say, yeah, keep doing what you're doing. Keep selling, keep working hard. And so I hear it. Next time I hear yelling again. And I'm like, okay, I know what it is this time. So I didn't get triggered. I walk out and they have all these books on that little blue table with the rickety legs. And so I go up and I'm an old school sci-fi nerd. And so I'm looking through the books and I find the Kurt Vonnegut novel. So I said, hey, what are y'all doing out there? And she said, oh, mister, we're out here selling books today. And I said, that's really cool. I said, are you making any money? Oh yeah, mister, we're making a lot of money. I said, okay, well, tell me how much it is. Oh, it's $2 for a hardback and it's $1 for a paperback. So I'm scanning through all the books and there's this old Kurt Vonnegut novel for you sci-fi fans out there. And I'm like, okay, let me get this. And I said, that's great. That's really great what you're doing. I said, by the way, where'd you get these books? Oh, mister, we got a great deal. The library was giving all these books away. So we took as many as we can to come up and sell them. So now I'm starting to think, okay, we got a true entrepreneur on our hands. And my second thought was, as much money as they're making on my corner, I'm gonna have to start charging them some lease rates. So then the last time, that I heard them out selling before they moved, is I walk out there and I'm like, okay, well, what do y'all got going on this time? This time they have a ton of toys. I don't know where they got them from, on their little rickety blue table. And she's like, hey, mister, good to see you. Hey, guess what? I got an easy bake oven if you want to buy it. I know your daughters are going to love to buy it. And at that point, I was like, nah, you're not going to get me again. But, again, so they were making a lot of money and doing a great and phenomenal job of entrepreneurs. And so when I first told this story is at the Topeka Anti-Poverty Conference a couple of years ago. And, somebody afterwards asked me, and they said, well, what do you think happened to those young ladies? And immediately, those with the negative connotations of the Black experience, Black kids or whatever, they're probably their first mindset is to go to some of the negative attributes of the social circumstances that a lot of young Black children face. But that's not even where my mind went with it. My mind went straight to this. The fact is that I said, and this is what I told the individuals at the conference, as I said, I don't know what's going to happen to this young lady, but I don't think it's going to be the best thing for her, the tall one. I said, because here's why. She's going to probably in school now. They're probably going to consistently tell her what kind of career she should be, focus on that to go out and get a job. Everything that she's been taught going from K through 12 is about how to work through other people. There's no community support and mechanisms to really rally around her. And a lot of the other things that would go into making her the best entrepreneurship, amplifying the characteristics she's clearly showed, are not going to be present. And so then probably what is most likely if she goes to college, she's going to wake up one day and say, you know what, it would be great if I remember when I was selling easy bake ovens on Mr. Gines' corner. I would love to be an entrepreneur again. Then at that point, we have to figure out how to completely retrain the mentality that we beat into her through the public education system or the education system in general about how to be a laborer. And then she's still going to go out and not find a great support system for herself as a young Black woman. And I use this as an example for what BIPOC entrepreneurs consistently have faced over the last nearly forever, but definitely since integration, where businesses became more connected to the broader community and less hyper-local. So that's what I wanted to share with you as a backstop for kind of what we're going to talk about, a BIPOC entrepreneurship development. And so I want to spend a second, really talking about my definition of equitable development. And I guess it would be useful to explain my background to you. So I am a certified economic developer. I have my CECD, a member of IEDC, International Economic Development Council, as a certified economic developer. And I've spent, over 20 years, 30 years almost, but 20 years in the field of banking, all in, either the Latino or Black communities in Omaha, before I moved into nonprofit and community development, where one of my stints was as a manager of a local incubator, executive director, and microloan fund, as well as some other things before ultimately, coming to the Fed. And I actually got my PhD working on ecosystems with a focus on local economic development. So this is something I've been thinking about in a long time. And this is because of where I live and where I came from in my community, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So when I define local economic development, it's something that I didn't just wake up one day and say, hey, we need to figure out a better way to do economic development for BIPOC communities. No, this is based upon an extensive thought, research, and activities in the space over the point of time. And so when I define economic development, I take a different approach than what has historically been in the field, which by and large is about economic growth, jobs, and taxes, right? So you go through it. For those of you who are economic developers, that's what you hear. The two main things your economic developers are going to report at the end of the year, your chambers, EDOs, others are going to talk about capital investment and jobs, right? And that's cool. There's a place for that. But I think one of the bigger things that we need to look at is what economic development can be. And so my definition is fostering a dynamic environment where economic opportunities can be discovered, taken advantage of, and maximized to their fullest extent to create balanced and sustainable economic growth, jobs, a positive sense of place, and an improved quality of life in a geographic region. And the things that I underline, I think, are very, very important. And honestly, if I was going to redo this, because I did this definition a couple of years ago before I started socializing it, I would put the term equitable in there, which we're going to spend some time talking about as well. But the concept of balance and sustainable growth, jobs, a sense of place, and improved quality of life. And if you look at that, and you look particularly on a large majority of our BIPOC communities where we have concentrated majority minority populations, this is not the thing. We have not done a great job of creating this kind of balance, sustainable growth, creation of jobs, positive sense of place, and improved quality of life. And it's very difficult to go anywhere. So I speak all around the nation. And most of the time they're in BIPOC communities or in BIPOC issues, unless it's the 50% of time that I'm in small rural communities, which is the other hat that I wear doing this work. But when I go to BIPOC communities and I look around, what I traditionally see, and I'm sure that you will feel the same that work in these communities, is a lack of underinvestment, a lack of sustainability, mismatch of jobs and job opportunities. And the sense of place is often a challenge because they're either mismarketed, misbranded, or the community, the collective broader community of the city has said, you know what, we need to kind of distance ourselves from that place because it's not a place where we want the average person that's coming into our city to go. So these are the things that we really need to consider when we talk about doing this kind of work and making equitable development more equitable. And so for me, equitable economic development is the utilization of economic development strategies that target creating economic growth and parity among traditionally disadvantaged groups or communities. So when me and Rodney wrote the ecosystem guide, one of the things that we did, which I had not seen anybody else do in whether the ecosystem space or other spaces, is we set as our due north within that racial wealth parity. So the objective is to really look at how your economic development strategies, if they're truly equitable, you should be starting to see a convergence of the wealth of the BIPOC population or community that you're serving, and the increase of that should be converging at least with the average of your communities at bare minimum. And what we're not seeing is that. I mean, in some statistics, it's estimated that the Black-white wealth gap is up to 22 times, that white individuals have 10 to 22 times, depending on which way it's calculated, more average wealth than the average Black household. There was a research that came out that said by 2053, the average Black wealth is projected to be 0. So in other words, our economic development strategies for African Americans in particular, and as well as the majority of other BIPOC groups, is going the other way. We're not seeing this convergence towards racial wealth equity. We're not seeing this increase in average wealth among BIPOC populations. And these are the things that should be on top of mind. Why? Because we all know that the demographics of the United States are changing very, very fast. And so to the degree in which we figure out ways to make sure development is equitable for all, to the degree where you create long-run economic growth and global competitiveness within the United States economy. And so historically, economic development is led by growth distribution agnostic models. That's just a fancy way of saying that as long as we can measure growth as a whole, it's all good. It doesn't matter who that growth goes to. It's the same with GDP. Like we use GDP as and growth as a headline indicator of the strength of the economy without really having the thorough conversations of how GDP is distributed to, BIPOC and other communities of color, disadvantaged communities. And so for me, the key areas of targeted long-run parity are business ownership, which we're going to spend most of our time talking about today, economic output as a whole, job creation, and then ultimately racial wealth equity. The long-run benefits to improved equity-based economic development are improved national economy, stronger communities with an increased quality of life, greater tax base and lower unemployment in local communities, and again, increased global competitiveness. So I want to take you, I need to kind of share with you why the current model that is dominant really doesn't work for BIPOC communities from a development lens. And so as part of my dissertation, what I did was I tracked back historically where the major movements in local economic development. And the first one is still the most dominant one that we use today. So the first one came out of the 1930s, and this was industrial recruitment. And though you've heard it by many terms, smokestack chasing, attraction-based economic development. And so this attraction and now retention strategies most often focused on some kind of cost reduction for like major businesses or larger businesses in a community. For those of you who've been keeping track with the news over the last couple of years, when Amazon was putting out their new headquarters, the amount of incentives that communities were trying to throw at Amazon to get those headquarters was astronomical. I heard somewhere upwards of $1 billion of incentive-based packages to kind of recruit and reduce the cost of business to Amazon. We're going to unpack that in a minute, but that's been the dominant one. It still is the dominant one. Then we had in the 80s, most people, when the term ecosystem, which we're going to chat about today, has been growing significantly in the nation. I've seen ecosystem used much, much more than I've ever heard used. But most people don't realize that entrepreneurial-led development strategies actually were a really big national thing in the 1980s. So I believe I read a report not too long ago that in the 80s, over 200 small business incubators were created around the United States. We had things like state-run venture capital firms that came, a lot of focus on import-export, the rise of a lot of technical assistance-based programs that happened in the 80s. And then that energy kind of waned. And then in the 90s, we had something called cluster-based development, which I'm not going to get into. And finally, my focus of my dissertation and my work over the last decade pretty much has been ecosystems. And ecosystems really are emerging. Initially, they started out as a Silicon Valley principle, trying to develop, strong systems to create high growth businesses. They've become much more generalized as people are saying, how do we look at the system as a whole and how it creates and supports startups of small businesses and entrepreneurs, and also making sure that they can scale. And so, like I put in there, prioritizes creating a nutrient-rich environment of hyperkinetic actors that support entrepreneurs as they start and scale companies. And so I'm going to spend a minute talking about the challenges of the model that Oklahoma City uses, Omaha uses, nearly every major city uses this, as well as some micropolitan areas, which is the attraction-based model or the industrial recruitment model of attraction and retention. And so here's the logic behind the model. And I'm going to talk about it, then I'm going to explain why it doesn't work for communities of color and BIPOC individuals as a whole. So the current development model is what is called economic development inputs. And these inputs usually, so think about it this way. Usually you have something like a chamber or economic city or public-private partnership with economic development organization. The state legislature passes all of these what are called incentive packages that these organizations can kind of use and sell to make sure that their community is ready, to receive one of these companies if they so choose them. The concept of choices is a big one. And so these incentives are usually based upon some form of tax abatements. So usually it's an income tax abatement, or it's some other function like tax increment financing, which reduces the cost to build or redevelop the land through some kind of tax policy or program. So essentially the model is we're going to give up a percentage of what we would traditionally charge for taxes to this firm. And because we believe that by giving up that type of revenue to the city and the municipality, it's in the long run going to be more beneficial because that major company is going to bring jobs and capital investment, right? And so essentially they're saying it's a trade-off, but the net benefit that we think is going to happen is that by making it cheaper for this company to do business or to stay in this community, it's going to have a long run more positive impact on the economy as a whole, because they're bringing in all these cool things like jobs and this, that, and the third, right? It's called large business attraction. And so the economic outputs expected of this are long run increase in tax revenue after the tax abatements wear off, jobs, and the expected quality of life. Now the tax increase over the long run is supposed to go back into the education, public amenities, and other things that we spend taxes on to make the quality of life happen. And this is something that I call trickle-down economic development. So if you remember the 1980s, the big thing about Reaganomics and Ronald Reagan's policies, people were calling it trickle-down, because the assumption was that if the rich get richer, they're ultimately going to create more businesses, and this is going to be better for the long-run economy. And so the individuals that are poor should be happy when wealthy people get tax breaks, because that investment is going to go back to spur the economy, and it's going to help them with their livelihood. Well, just like that didn't bear itself out, industrial attraction-based models have not corrected the challenges of inequity within economic development within BIPOC communities. And the proof is just in the eye test. I just told you that we've been working on this model since 1930s. And I also just told you that the wealth gap of the African Americans is nearly 10 to 20 times, depending on the calculation, that of whites, and projected Black wealth is supposed to go to zero. Therefore, if this is the model that has been dominant, that's most consistent, that we're trained upon as economic developers, that our state legislatures put packages in, incentive packages and programs in to recruit firms, and we are doing this model and we're not seeing growth. And in fact, we're seeing a greater national wealth gap and a greater challenge to creating wealth in BIPOC communities, then we can easily say that this is a model that in and of itself, or at the scale in which it is used, does not work, and it creates inequity within the system, and it keeps communities of color often at a competitive economic disadvantage and challenged with economic growth. And the reason why is this: the concept of structural employment. So just because you can recruit a firm into your community does not mean that the jobs, one, are at a living wage, or two, have the capacity, the community has the capacity to take those jobs. So just because you bring in, let's say, major corporation X, and they bring 500 jobs, it's not necessarily true that a large majority of those jobs are going to go to address, are going to be suitable for the jobs of the BIPOC populations that you want to create employment for. Second, it's the concept of asset ownership and wealth creation. Remember, a job is an indirect form of wealth creation. You have to take the income that you earn from the job and then turn around and invest it as an owner to create, whether it's in the home ownership or some form of stock or business, for it to be a true wealth creator. So the people that traditionally get enriched by industrial attraction models are the shareholders of the major corporations that are the ones that are getting the tax abatement. Because remember, how do you increase shareholder value, which is the predominant mission of corporations, according to my finance professor, is you increase earnings over time. There's a quarterly earnings system, which then you look at the stock rate goes up. Those that own the stock, tend to be the ones that benefit most from industrial attraction models. And what do we know about BIPOC communities and communities of color? We have a lower asset ownership in the stock market than any other group. So inherently, those that benefit the most from that kind of model from a wealth creation standpoint are the ownership class and those that own stock in these major corporations, which we're cutting these deals for. And then finally, the concept of community resiliency and identity. Industrial attraction, historically has been growth agnostic. This concept of equitable development is only rarely modern phenomenon. And before it was like, let's get the businesses that either we think fit or will drive, headline revenue into the community and inflate our collective GDP. It has nothing to do with the things that make a community, which is the sense of place, the sense of identity. And in many ways, if not careful, these kind of strategies can lead to gentrification. So that's, setting up the framework. And I want to give you a lived example, and I want to leave about at least 7 to 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to zoom through a lot of this. And a lot of these upcoming slides are just data points. So Omaha, Nebraska is an example that I use, my hometown. The reason I got into this field in the first place was to address how economically distressed and challenged the community I live in, our Black community, was. And so it's a tale of two cities, that old Dickens novel. And I put up some numbers, for you when I first gave this. So in 2016, best cities to find a job. 2015, most caring cities, best cities to work in tech, blah, blah, blah. You can see all of that, all these awesome things, awesome awards and notable things that we've won. We have more Fortune 500 companies at one point than any other community in the United States. We had Warren Buffett and all the Berkshire Hathaway millionaires, all of these. But then our community commissioned a Pew report in 2008, and it said it was number 3 among America's 100 largest metros with the 3rd highest Black poverty rate. Number 1 percentage of Black childhood poverty in the nation, with nearly 6 of 10 Black kids living below the poverty line. Number 2, only one other U.S. metro, Minneapolis, at the time had a higher economic disparity between how Black and white residents fare. So you look at kind of this tension between one that is dominated by an industrial attraction model. At the time, Nebraska, had, according to research, the 3rd highest per capita expenditure on corporate incentives in the nation. And you have this huge disparity with what's going on within the Black community. So again, I argue that if that model was working to create equity, we would not see these data points that we're seeing. Now, of course, that was a little bit dated and they fluctuate from time to time, but you get the point that I'm trying to make here. And so how do we address this concern? And my argument has consistently been that if we want to do effective economic development in BIPOC communities, we need to lead with entrepreneurship, and we need to leverage our corporate and industrial attraction models versus the other way around, which is what it traditionally is. So we're going to talk about that for a minute. And just a few quick data points. Business ownership has historically been a strong wealth builder for communities of color. Nationally, the median net worth of Black and Latinx business owners is more than 10 times that of their peers who don't own a business. Some of the other reasons: entrepreneurs create jobs, increase local wealth, strongly associated with faster growth of local economies, connect to the global, boom, 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 boom. These are all, Mariana can send you out the PowerPoint if you want. And so when you look at all these numbers, the argument for entrepreneurship is pretty compelling. And I just want to go through a few numbers for you. So in Oklahoma, according to the most recent 2017 data, there was 15,600 total firms that had employees. And of those, 12,000 were white, 334 were Black, 452 Native American, 816 Asian, and 630 Hispanic. And this is an important number because when you look at it, the comparison of employer-owned firms to the population of these respective groups is very, very skewed. So for example, white employee-owned firms represent 77% of all entrepreneurial firms, and yet they only represent 66% of the population. Conversely, the Black population is 50%, but yet represent only 2% of all employer-owned firms. And if we kind of look at the numbers, the average white firm with employees represents $2.4 million, the average Black firm, $838,000. And you can see the rest of the numbers. The skew is usually between 2 to 1 to potentially 3 to 1 difference between those employer-owned firms. So even when these BIPOC communities are creating employer-owned firms, on average, they're usually less than half the revenue of the white firms. And the employee structure is pretty simple. And this is the one that I do want to pull out. And this is from 2012, the most recent data that we have on it. So it's not only the fact that we have fewer employer-owned firms, the percentage of firms when we do create firms in BIPOC communities is actually significantly lower from them to go from a non-employer firm, meaning it's just them doing their thing, to actually having an employees. And so when you look at it, roughly 1 out of every 4 white businesses is an employer-owned firm. Compare that to the Black business ratio. So 94% of all Black businesses do not have an employee. Only 6% do. And when you look at the biggest difference, this is why that's important. And I switched the colors of the chart, so hopefully it's a little bit more visible for you. So when you look at the difference, a Black firm in 2012 that had employees was generating on average $750,000 a year. The business without employees had $41,000. So you see the dramatic difference when we can help businesses scale, grow to not just the impact in BIPOC households and communities, but to the economy as a whole. And again, with the demographic shifts, we need to be looking at this chart and say, okay, wait a minute, if the white population as a percentage of total population in the United States is declining, and yet the jobs and the revenue that they're producing is significantly higher, what happens to long-run economic competitiveness if we don't figure out a way to scale BIPOC businesses? We don't find a way to create equity in the creation and growth of BIPOC businesses. You begin to look at potential economic challenges. And so this is the final chart that I have to kind of show what I'm talking about. So when we look at the challenges, so we said that the average wealth rate of entrepreneurs for BIPOC communities is roughly 10 times higher than non-entrepreneurial households. And you have to believe that with the rates of entrepreneurship that we're seeing among these communities, it's reflected in household income distribution. And so with this chart, going again to the Black population here in Oklahoma City, 48% of Black households generate under $30,000 a year. It's by far the largest, so literally almost 1 out of 5. And so when I looked at I went to the MIT, living wage calculator and just did a ballpark eyeball test because it's a little wonky the way you have to calculate it. But for a household of 2.6 people, which is the average, I believe, in Oklahoma City, it would take approximately $60,000 a year to have a living wage. So, and half of that, the 48% of Black population in this city make half of what it would be to be a living wage according to MIT. Now we know that as communities of color and BIPOC communities, we find a way to survive. It's what we've always done. So, but looking at that 60,000 as a benchmark. So, and then you start looking through the distribution curves of the rest of the populations. And what you're seeing is that there's very, very few households in any of these cities that are making over 50,000 a year on the regular, especially 50% of that population. And you have to connect the dots to economic development strategies, which is designed to create economic growth. And if it's equitable for all, and entrepreneurship, which drives wealth creation, and you have much more likelihood of being a millionaire for sure, but having a higher wealth in your household in these numbers right here. And so we're going to spend the next 5 or so minutes on talking about the entrepreneurship ecosystem a little bit, and some other thoughts on equitable development before we get to any other Q&A. And so the ecosystem is basically broken into 6 dimensions. So what are the skills of the entrepreneurs that are starting their businesses? What is the capital access, which is always a big one that we talk about? The social capital, are we having functioning and fluid relationships, allowing entrepreneurs in the community to connect entrepreneurs into things that are going to give them education, benefits, capital, and knowledge and opportunity? Culture is a big one, under talked about. Is there a culture of entrepreneurship, of appropriate risk-taking in the economic development space? Infrastructure is a big one. In rural, we talk broadband, broadband, broadband. We have broadband and digital literacy issue in many of our BIPOC communities as well, but we're also talking about the underdevelopment that many of these communities have faced when it's a place-based approach with a lot of historical urban sprawl, going back to the 70s, urban renewal, which cut a lot of BIPOC communities in half. The lack of quality streetscape, facade improvement, cleanliness, things like that happen in a lot of our BIPOC communities. And then finally, are we having effective policy? And while I lay them out in a row like this, what it really looks like is this. These things are all interconnected and reinforce each other. And honestly, if you're doing effective entrepreneurship ecosystem building and looking at the system as a whole, then you have to start with the entrepreneur as a center and see what is driving, maneuvering, how these things connect to those entrepreneurs, especially in our BIPOC community. And so this is kind of how economic development works from a pyramid lens. And this is credit to Rodney Sampson, my co-author, and I took this directly from the guide. So ecosystem building, actually, when you look at it from a BIPOC lens, starts much, much earlier than when that entrepreneur says that they have an idea to start a business. We're going back to early exposure in education. This means our educational and paraeducational institutions, connecting with that skills development to prepare them for entrepreneurs. Talent placement. Are we looking at how we're placing folks in summer entrepreneurships through the education system, apprenticeships, early roles for people to do summer jobs and things like that? Then we get into the innovation, entrepreneurship, marketing, capital access, things that we talk about quite a bit. So I'm not going to belabor the point on that. And so what we're trying to do with the BIPOC ecosystem is we're trying to take what is called a foggy and fragmented ecosystem where you have let's say a Black woman entrepreneur and Latino woman entrepreneur that says, I want to start a business. And then they get out there and they can't find the resources. The resources aren't connected. The culture isn't supportive. The networks aren't working together to say, once somebody has that idea, there's a fluid way, in a transparent way in which they can connect to all the resources necessary to be able to start their role. And then what we're also facing in BIPOC communities is a sparse ecosystem. So the example again from Omaha, when I started at the Fed in 2011, I was like, I'm so excited to go to Kansas City to see all of these cool new things that are happening for Black communities, diverse communities in terms of entrepreneurship. I go up to Kansas City, they were worse than us in Omaha. At the time, we had 8 microfinance organizations and support systems. But what has happened since then is it's been a full role reversal. And in fact, Omaha's went backwards, in which we once had 8 micro lenders that served the BIPOC communities. We're now down to 2, and we have no entrepreneurship support organization in our predominant Black organization, and only one small one in our Hispanic population. Whereas Kansas City went the other way around, and densifying their network. So in many BIPOC communities, we don't have an ecosystem full of the things necessary to adequately support their business ambitions. And so anytime that you put a hurdle rate in front of somebody or something, it makes it more difficult to do, which makes it either more likely not to start or more likely to fail or not scale. And so ultimately what we want to do is create a transparent and dense ecosystem so entrepreneurs can be entrepreneurs. Black entrepreneurs, Latino entrepreneurs, Asian entrepreneurs, Native entrepreneurs just want to be able to build their business as efficiently as possible, like anybody else. And that's what an effective ecosystem will allow them to do. And then there's an issue that we also face, which is this issue of accessibility. And I first started talking about this when I was going around doing conversations on the Black Women Startups Report. So just because you have a program that supports entrepreneurs in the community does not mean it's accessible to everybody in that community. There's a reason that there's barriers to entry in a lot of these things. And so let's talk through a few of those things. So you could have a program that's available to support a particular type of entrepreneur, but it may not be financially accessible to that entrepreneur. The time and duration accessibility, the time may be too long. And you may be doing it at a time of day where diverse entrepreneurs cannot participate. Location accessibility. How long is the travel distance for that entrepreneur to get to that location? The design accessibility. Have you designed it in such a way that it's either too complex or too simple for your entrepreneurs? The education level accessibility. Intellectually rigorous or intellectually weak. Culture and gender accessibility, participant feels unwelcome or discriminated against. So when we are building out our entrepreneurial program, our economic development programs that support entrepreneurship and heck, workforce, you go down the list, we have to really look at the fact, are we just saying that a program is available, or is it really, really accessible? Quick example that I give that. Most people don't realize that the majority age of the most successful technology startup founder is 44, biotech is early 50s. Yet most of these ecosystem things that we historically have done have been targeted towards young individuals. Many of these things are done after hour network events. And, you know, if you're like me, I go to bed at 8:30 now because I got to get up at 4:30. So if you're having an event at 8:30 or 9, and I'm a 48-year-old guy going out to hang out with a bunch of 23, 4-year-old folks that are drinking beer, because I really don't drink like that, it is available, but it's not really accessible to me. And so that's a kind of a litmus test. And so I kind of want to get to the closure by talking about some potential things to focus on, you know, when we really are thinking about creating more equitable development in general with BIPOC as a focus. First, focus on creating creators versus consumers of jobs in BIPOC communities by building strong entrepreneurial ecosystems. If you want to solve the higher unemployment rate, allow local entrepreneurs that understand the marketplace and can build firms that can serve that market of potential labor needs. To build strong and vibrant relationships with BIPOC entrepreneurs, BIPOC community organizations, and BIPOC leaders. I mean, how many times are our economic developers sitting around having coffee, you know, with these leaders? Diversify the decision makers of economic development policy and strategy making it more inclusive of BIPOC individuals. Who's around the table of your primary development and policy-making decisions? Is it a diverse representative of individuals who understand the needs of their community, of their community's entrepreneurs? Are they empowered to influence policy and to make decisions on what happens in the development space? Create incentives and policies that focus on developing entrepreneurs across the continuum, micro to gazelle with the specific focus on BIPOC populations. Connect the two forms of development. And if I had more time, I would spend about 10 minutes really talking about, if you're really going to be consistently committed to industrial attraction, here's how you can make it more equitable. But that's a conversation for another day. Influence local schools to both become more entrepreneurial and teach more entrepreneurship. And finally, recognize that it takes time and eliminate a short-term reward mindset. So we're looking at a 5 to 10 year, really robust planability ecosystem. But at the end of that, your pipeline of entrepreneurs should be full. You should start seeing, the commitment of entrepreneurs in terms of being able to make high growth decisions, employment, and really influence the economic development environment at that point. And so with that, you're always welcome to contact me if you want to learn more information. Feel free. I'm an open book. You can find me on social media. You can email me. You can visit us at the kansascityfed.org community, which I really encourage you to do. And with that, I'll stop. And if there's any questions, we'll take some questions.
Okay, yes. So we have a few minutes for questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Gines, for your incredible presentation. I really appreciated the historical context, the data, and I'll say data again, frameworks and the tactics or application of those specific frameworks. A major takeaway that I get from this is we need to know and continue to get to know our communities as both challenges and opportunities arrive, and that includes through relationships, through conversations, but also through being data informed and evaluating the tools that we have, including policies and incentives to better support our community as a whole. One question that we have, a couple of questions. As a business owner, how can we be more active in pushing this along and fostering this concept?
I'll be honest, I wish you didn't have to be. My preference is that our entrepreneurs do entrepreneurship. And but unfortunately though, in BIPOC communities, we're forced to wear multiple hats in that regard. And so I think one of the things that you can do is participate in your chambers, both your minority chambers, diverse chambers, and your major chamber, and be a voice. Continue to tell them what you need. I mean, and because you know better than anybody else. Also, and I say this especially when I speak in Black communities, never ask other people what you're unwilling to do for yourself. So go to your churches, go to your community organizations, urban leagues, and whatever, and begin to set the expectation that they support entrepreneurship. That's the way it used to be done. Most people don't realize that back in the day, the Black entrepreneurship rate coming out of slavery increased 1,000% in 50 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. We produced 200 plus banks. We produced over 200 HBCUs in that period of time. A large percentage of that was embedded in the church, where the church was used as a clearinghouse for the initial, basically a crowdfunding location to begin to launch all these insurance firms in other places. So we tend to always externalize, the change that we want to see. And it's a tandem. We need to demand from broader civil society what should be, equitable for us, because as tax-paying American citizens, and in our own personal community, we should really work with them to build that sense of community where they're supporting us as entrepreneurs. It's a lot of work, and I wish you didn't have to do it, but we're not at a place where our entrepreneurs can just be entrepreneurs at this point, but we need them to also be advocates.
Wise words for sure. So we have a question and a statement. I'm a co-founder of a newly developed Black community organization here in Oklahoma City, and was wondering, do you offer consultation on how this information can be specifically applied to our coalition?
Yeah, informally, that just shoot me an email. We set up a time and chat.
Wonderful, thank you. Last question, what does the entrepreneurship ecosystem look like in Oklahoma? Are there any mentorship opportunities for BIPOC business owners?
I'm not sure. Not being from here, I'm not, really well immersed in it. I know Tulsa's doing some really great things. I think they're probably at this point, just from my general senses, ahead of Oklahoma City in regard of supporting, diverse entrepreneurs and some of the things they're trying to do with the programs that I've talked to them about. And so I do think, and that's a good point, Tulsa's only an hour and a half away. I don't know what the connectivity is, but I really think that there's opportunities to look at how you do this work in tandem and leverage each other's assets with each other. We're one big community. We're trying to achieve the same thing. But just by looking at the numbers and what I hear when I did the Black Women Startups report, haven't looked too deeply into the Hispanic population. I know you got a pretty decent chamber here. But regardless, I've not seen any community anywhere that I've been around the nation that at this point I would say is doing what they really should be doing for BIPOC entrepreneurship. And I think we saw that during the pandemic, which was a small business oriented pandemic after you get past the public health side of it, that so many of our businesses our BIPOC businesses were suffering because they weren't really that strong. The ecosystem, wasn't really that strong in terms of supporting them.
Correct. And I have a couple of thoughts on that, but Clarence, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to share a question?
Yes, ma'am. My name is Clarence. I'm the owner of the CS Construction, LLC, and my credentials will verify the fact that I am now known as a grant maker. I have been registered with SAM registration. I've been registered with the state with my LLC. I'm a service disabled veteran-owned small business. I have several projects I'm working on. One, to preserve my historical school that I graduated from, as well. And the other one is the fact that my great-great-grandfather was a Choctaw Nation Indian man, a medicine man, I mean. And his name was Jack Campbell. So I've done some genealogy research, and I just want to use my credentials to pretty much first to restore my school that I graduated from in '67, and two, to try to get further the documentation on the Trail of Tears from Jack Campbell, which is my great-great-grandfather, up until the time that I graduated from my high school that needs to be restored.
So yeah, Clarence, sorry if I cut you off, but I know we're like on a short clock right now.
Okay, thank you.
But I think just my general thoughts on that are like, with your credentials and your desire, I think the first thing that I would probably do is really try to pull a small group of the community together of shared interests and begin to work to build it out. At this point, we need to cease trying to do things as individuals. unless there's clearly no other way to get it done, because building it out through the community structure and a collaborative structure allows you to do the things you do best and bring other people around you. And it sounds like you got the credentials and you got a great idea. Very interesting to me, that Trail of Tears. We looked at that when we did a Black Wall Street article, me and Chad. But really look for, and I think this is where your ecosystem work really comes in, because if you develop a strong ecosystems, people like Clarence can plug into that, and it is an enhancement versus him trying to figure out how to do all of this stuff and calling up somebody like a Dell Gines who he doesn't know in Omaha, Nebraska, because he can't find a ready resource in his own community. So I think we're at time, Mariana, so I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Okay, thank you so much. What I want to share is, so this is the first of many webinar events, and so our virtual events. And so what I would like to just offer to the group, again, there's going to be the second part of this series tonight at 5:30. In addition to that, we will be discussing both financial and non-financial entrepreneurial resources that currently exist in the Oklahoma City ecosystem in September. So please stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, specifically for Progress OKC, we have curated technical assistance as well as microloan products and partnerships to address some of these gaps, and we'll continue to do so with our partners, ecosystem partners. So thank you again to Dr. Gines for your time today, and again, sharing with us what it really looks like to have an inclusive economic development strategy that really addresses widening equity gaps that persist even as the economy grows. And so with that, I'm going to actually throw it over to Matt to share some final thoughts, and then we'll wrap up for the day. Thank you all so much.
Just fantastic opening to this webinar series. Dr. Gines, fantastic. And I hope that everybody, as we go through these webinars, that this really is about giving yourself permission about personal leadership development. Truly is kind of the bottom line for any entrepreneur's success, is to give themselves permission to lead themselves, to accept resources, to accept mentors, and to collaborate with resources and